I do see that variance in, especially in private collectors, about, if this piece is just for purely investment, or if it's like a passion piece that they just love and they're going to pass it on to a museum or their children or somewhere in between. On either end of that spectrum, preserving and caring for the collection is equally as important for different reasons, right? On one end, clinically, you're protecting an investment, you're protecting that asset and that resource to preserve the value of it. Because as we know, if things are really deteriorated and damaged, the value goes down. And on the other end of the spectrum, caring for these things and cherishing them only makes them last longer for future generations. So I think that's a great point that you brought up. And I'm wondering, do you think that private collectors can learn from museums and that museums can learn from private collectors in the ways in which they have a relationship with the art in their collection?
Certainly, I think that's an area where sometimes collectors don't realize that museums can be resources, right, for the proper care of artwork, right? And oftentimes it's free, right? Just to get information on, hey, what's the proper, temperature to store a certain work at, or how, how should I protect this while in transit? Just, any number of topics that can relate to a particular artwork. Museums can certainly offer their expertise in knowledge of for museum collectors. So that's, I think, a resource that often sometimes is untapped. But if I think that's kind of a knowledgeable collector that understands that they're not just, the museums aren't just there to acquire works and continue to do that, but they can be there as a resource for them. So it's in my career, honestly, that question from collectors, unless they were knowledgeable about that, it didn't often come up. And you realize that it's sometimes they contact museums when there's a problem rather than being proactive. And that's unfortunate, because by that point, it's like, okay, well, if you had kind of done this at the outset, we might not be in this particular situation. And I think a lot of the times that now, because of, be honest, climate change, depending on where a collection is based, you have to start thinking about that process, right? About like, hey, what happens, and when I worked in Miami for many years, it's like, what happens when you get hit by a hurricane, right? How do I protect these things? What's my plan for, emergency preparedness? I think that's an important part of protecting your artwork and your assets. So
That's a great point about climate changing and being in areas that are susceptible to earthquakes, hurricanes, fire, whether it's forest fire or just, urban fire scenarios. And I agree with you that a lot of the private collectors that I speak to, this proactive prevention, of damage isn't really something on their radar, whereas it is very much for most museum institutions. They have museum operations, emergency operations plan that usually addresses the collection. Do you think that there's a maybe affordable and sustainable way for us to bring that practice into private collections of this emergency preparedness and this proactive maintenance of the collection?
I think there is, but it's kind of bridging that gap, right, between that, collectors, because you can't really group them all into one place and be like, all right, let's find a way to communicate with them all. But organizations like, ARCS, Association of Registrar and Collection Specialists, or other bodies that come together and discuss these topics, right, and how to put that out there. And I think it's something that you just have to be more aware of, to realize like, hey, what we're doing matters in terms of providing a tool and knowledge to people that are take that on as something that they're doing, art collecting. So it's I think finding that connection point, because not everyone is aware of it.